sat on the narrow wooden bench beside the frosted altar of the hearth, my fingers moving with methodical precision. The great keep of frost wood was already filling with the sharp, echoing sounds of the high elite gathering for the Solstice alignment. I could hear their muted laughter bouncing off the heavy stone pillars, the kind of polished, cruel amusement reserved for those they considered already discarded. The air in the sanctuary was bitter, thick, with the tension of expected theatre. They were waiting for my public dismissal. I chose to give them nothing but my absolute, quiet focus. Resting across my knees was the silver lichen wrap. It was a heavy, hand-woven ceremonial garment, marking my inherited position as the keeper of the sacred seeds. Most omegas of the pack viewed the botanical role as a quaint obsolete, an administrative placeholder for females lacking the brute strength of warriors or the vast wealth of mining heirs. I knew better. As my needle pierced the thick, interwoven fibers of the wrap, I tested the structural integrity of the dried northern hemlock seeds I was securing into the hem. The husks needed to be perfectly dry to withstand the freezing temperatures of the outer wastes. If the cellular walls of the pods were compromised by frost, the lineage of the sacred flora would perish before the next thaw. I paused, drawing a length of ceremonial binding thread through the rough fabric. Bringing the waxed cord closer to my face, I inhaled a sharp breath. It smelled distinctly of damp earth and crushed river moss. It should have carried the sharp, burning scent of high-altitude pine incense, the traditional fragrance used to purify the solstice bindings. The discrepancy was small, perhaps invisible to anyone who did not spend their days cataloguing root systems and soil acidities. To me, it meant the ceremonial stewards had rushed the preparation, substituting valley loam for mountain resin. It was a careless administrative oversight. I let that knowledge settle into me like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. The cold seeping up from the stone floor bit into my ankles, but I kept my posture rigidly straight. They always said an omega should know her place. My place was right here, ensuring the biological continuity of the Northern Territory, even as the very people who relied on my quiet labor gathered to watch the formal unsealing of Marin Sterling. I pressed another brittle seed into the silver lichen wrap, counting the remaining pods in my pouch by touch alone. 14 hemlock seeds, 12 frost-resistant cedar cores, 8 alpine fireroot cuttings. The inventory grounded me. The impending humiliation of the mating ceremony was merely a political procedure. The survival of these seeds was a physical law. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the keep shuddered open, dragging a violent gust of winter wind into the hall. The ambient chatter of the pack's elite immediately died down, replaced by the rustle of heavy silks and shifting armor as the crowd parted to form a wide, respectful aisle. Logan Thorne walked into the sanctuary, occupying the silence with the heavy, unhurried steps of a ruling alpha who believed his authority was a permanent geological feature of the land. His boots struck the frost-slicked stone in a measured, aggressive rhythm, demanding the undivided attention of every elder and dignitary present. Beside him walked Evelyn Drake. She did not trail half a step behind, as was the custom for an unbonded consort, entering the sacred hearth space during a formal ceremony. Instead, she matched his stride perfectly, her posture a masterclass in calculated political elevation. The heiress to the southern silver mines wore a gown of deep crimson velvet, a stark, deliberate contrast to the bleak greys and whites of our mountain home. She moved with the smooth, performative politeness of a woman who had already purchased the room and was merely waiting for the receipt to be signed. Her presence was a loud declaration of wealth, overriding the solemn traditions of the sanctuary. As they reached the base of the altar steps, Logan paused to acknowledge the murmuring elders gathered in the witness circle. It was in that brief moment of stillness that Evelyn turned toward him. She raised a pale, gloved hand and adjusted the collar of his heavy wolf fur mantle. It was not a gesture of romantic affection, nor was it the nervous fussing of a new bride. The movement was a delicate but firm proprietary tug, a sharp realignment of the heavy pelt across his broad shoulders. I watched her smooth the coarse fur down over his collarbone, noting the precise, unyielding angle of her wrist. It was the physical expression of administrative dominance. She was not merely adjusting his wardrobe. She was signaling to the entire assembly that she now managed his presentation, his decisions, and his political alliances. Logan allowed the adjustment without protest. I did not lower my gaze. I simply set my needle down on the wooden bench, resting my hands evenly over the silver lichen wrap in my lap. I watched them step beneath the towering arches of the great keep, two people utterly convinced that power was something you could buy with silver and wear like a fur cloak. They did not understand the architecture of the very ground beneath their feet. They saw only the surface of the stone, entirely ignorant of the thermal pressure building silently below. As they approached the frosted ceremonial stone, I noted that the ice rhyming the edges of the dark basalt was thicker this year. I felt the ambient chill seeping through the thin soles of my boots, a quiet physical reminder of the waning thermal flow beneath the great keep. The air smelled of cracked ice and old wood smoke, heavy with the weight of the Solstice alignment. Logan took his place opposite me on the raised dais, his posture rigid beneath his heavy ceremonial furs. He did not look like a man preparing to sever a sacred, instinctual mate bond. He looked like an anxious ledger-keeper, preparing to close out an unprofitable account. Beside him, Evelyn kept her chin perfectly leveled, her expression a mask of polite, aristocratic detachment. She wore a tailored mantle dyed in the deep, rich indigo of the Southern Territories, a stark visual contrast to the coarse, undyed fabrics of our northern service classes. The silver clasps at her collar caught the dim light of the overhead brazier, broadcasting her inherited wealth to every elder in the room. She did not sneer at me. She simply looked through me, treating my presence as a minor administrative hurdle that had already been resolved in private. When Logan finally spoke, his voice carried the rehearsed, metallic cadence of a trade decree. He did not bellow with the aggressive dominance expected of a territorial pack leader. Instead, he projected his words toward the vaulted ceiling, intentionally bypassing my gaze. The survival of the Frostwood domain relies upon the structural integrity of its alliances, the Alpha declared, his tone flat, sanded smooth of any genuine emotion. He paused, adjusting the heavy iron cuffs of his coat rather than meeting my eyes. Current ecological pressures demand a recalibration of our primary resources. The integration of the southern silver mines is no longer a strategic preference, but a mandatory requirement for our continued sovereignty. The words were pressed into the freezing air like a seal into hardening wax, rigid and immovable. He was framing a brutal personal betrayal as a matter of civic logistics. I watched the muscle in his jaw flex, the only outward sign of the underlying cowardice driving his ambition. He was terrified to look directly at the woman he was discarding, fearing that any eye contact might force him to acknowledge the moral debt he was defaulting on. Therefore, the man continued, reading the invisible script he had clearly memorized, I formally assess the bloodline of Marin Sterling as insufficient to sustain the heavy burdens of the Winter Ward. The energetic demands of the pack outstrip her biological capacity. I dissolve this preliminary bond. Lady Evelyn will assume the position of High Consort, effective immediately upon the closing of this ceremony. He delivered the final sentence with a sharp, relieved exhale, as if he had just finished reciting a particularly tedious legal clause in a border dispute. A ripple of calculated murmurs swept through the high elite gathered in the observation tiers. Someone near the eastern stone pillar let out a low, patronizing scoff, followed by a scattered handful of mocking snickers from the southerner's entourage. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. They expected a public unraveling, a desperate plea for mercy, a weeping demand for a lesser concubine status, anything to ensure I would not be cast out to freeze in the outer wastes. Instead, I simply looked down at my hands. The ceremonial ash from the initial blessing was still warm on my palms, a dark, gritty smudge against my pale skin. Moving with deliberate slowness, I wiped the crushed charcoal from my fingers onto my coarse linen skirt. The black dust settled deep into the unbleached weave, staining the fabric permanently. I felt a deep, resonant ache that arrived without the mercy of shock. I let the reality of his cowardice settle into my chest like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack until there was no room left for grief. I did not raise my voice to demand an explanation. I did not curse his lineage or throw myself at the steps of the dais. My hands rose smoothly to my shoulders, my fingers locating the heavy iron pins, holding my ceremonial garments in place. The silver lichen wrap rested heavy against my collarbones, a hand-woven testament to my official position as keeper of the sacred seeds. It was not a decorative garment, but a highly functional badge of territorial survival, woven from the rare, heat-retaining flora of the deep geothermal caves. I unfastened the left pin, then the right, the metal biting cold against my calloused fingertips. I slid the sacred wrap from my shoulders with methodical precision. As the fabric left my skin, the ambient temperature of the room seemed to drop another fraction of a degree. The murmurs in the hall began to falter. The elite spectators shifted in their carved wooden seats, their anticipated entertainment souring into profound confusion. I did not throw the garment at his feet in a fit of melodramatic rage. I held the pale, shimmering fabric out in front of me, aligning the edges with quiet, practiced care. I folded the material once in half, smoothing a sharp crease down the center. I folded it a second time, aligning the corners perfectly. The vast architecture of the great keep seemed to amplify the small, crisp sound of the dry lichen brushing against itself. When the square was immaculately formed, I stepped forward and laid the folded object gently onto the cold stone floor at the base of the altar. I stepped back, adjusting my posture until my spine was entirely straight, my hands resting loosely at my sides, not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. That was the absolute stillness that overtook the Frostwood assembly. The mocking laughter had died completely, replaced by an awkward, heavy tension that pressed uncomfortably against the eardrums. Logan finally broke his upward gaze, his eyes darting downward. He stared at the perfectly folded square of silver lichen, his rehearsed, administrative confidence visibly fracturing under the crushing weight of my quiet composure. The stillness that descended upon the great keep did not feel like peace. It felt like the heavy, breathless pressure before a structural collapse, amplifying the smallest, most mundane sounds of administrative procedure. At the far edge of the frosted altar, Elder Donald Ward moved with the slow, methodical precision of a man who viewed human ruin as nothing more than a clerical obligation. He did not look at me. He did not need to. In the eyes of the regional hierarchy, a rejected Omega was no longer a person. She was merely an administrative error that required immediate, documented correction. Donald unrolled a thick sheet of heavy, pressed parchment onto the ceremonial stone table. The cold draft sweeping through the high-arched windows made the material stiff and curling, resisting the heavy iron weights he placed on its corners to hold it flat. Banishment in the northern domain was never a wild, chaotic expulsion driven by fangs and physical violence. It was a tedious, bureaucratic machinery designed to strip away identity layer by layer, ensuring the discarded had no legal ground left to stand upon. Logan stood a few paces away, his posture rigid, radiating the impatient energy of an alpha, eager to finalize a profitable transaction. He wanted the paperwork finished. He wanted my name officially struck from the registry, so his new alliance could be formally sealed in the blood of the pack. Donald dipped his brass-nibbed pen into a small glass vial of iron gall ink. The air in the cavernous room was so perfectly still that when he pressed the nib to the parchment, the sound magnified against the high stone ceilings. Scrape, squeak, the sharp, grating noise cut through the tension, a high-pitched friction of metal against dried pulp that set the teeth of the assembled crowd on edge. It was an ugly, utilitarian sound. Each stroke of the pen documented the revocation of my shelter, my winter rations, and my right to walk with aboard the borders of the geothermal heartlands. I watched the black ink bleed into the coarse fibers of the paper, letting the reality of the moment settle into my chest. There was no grand betrayal speech from the elders, no dramatic declarations of my unworthiness. There was only the squeal of Donald's pen, spelling out my exile in cramped, meticulous handwriting. He blotted the wet ink with a piece of grey felt, his movements unhurried, treating my banishment with the same emotional investment he might give to an inventory of wintergrain. Next to the parchment, a thick candle burned low, its melting beeswax mingling with the scent of pine resin. Donald held a stick of black sealing wax to the flame, letting the dark drops fall onto the bottom of the page before pressing the heavy iron seal of the elders into the puddle. Logan shifted his weight, his heavy boots grinding softly against the gravel dust scattered over the flagstones. He was waiting for me to break. The entire council was waiting for the inevitable moment when the low-status botanist would drop to her knees and beg for a lesser position. A scullery maid, a field worker, anything to avoid the frozen outer wastes. His jaw tightened when I did not move. My absolute composure was an insult to his authority, denying him the cruel satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I had spent enough of my life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. I kept my spine straight, my breathing slow and measured, watching the black wax cool on the warrant that erased my life. With the legal mechanics of my exile underway, I turned away from the altar and walked toward the small side table where my personal effects had placed before the ceremony. My movements were deliberately steady. I did not rush. I reached for the modest leather satchel containing my botanical pouches, feeling the familiar, comforting shapes of dried yarrow, crushed comfrey root, and winter-hardy seeds through the worn hide. The faint, sharp scent of dried rosemary and bitter willow bark rose from the bag. These were the tools of my quiet labor, the unseen work that sustained the sick and the injured of this pack, now packed away in silence. A shift in the heavy atmosphere of the room, a sudden wave of expensive jasmine oil and the metallic chime of jewelry, signaled her approach before she even stepped into my peripheral vision. Evelyn Drake stopped on the opposite side of the small wooden table. Her gown was a masterwork of southern silk and intricate silver embroidery, a sharp visual contrast to the coarse, undyed linen I wore. She carried the effortless confidence of a noblewoman who had just purchased a kingdom, yet there was a tight, uneasy geometry to her posture. She did not like my silence. She did not understand how a woman who had just lost everything could stand so perfectly still while packing dried weeds. "The outer wildlands are unforgiving this time of year," Evelyn said, her voice pitched in a tone of practiced, velvety sympathy that did not reach her dark eyes. It was the voice of a victor attempting to play the benevolent patron, masking a deep-seated insecurity with polite condescension. She reached into the folds of her velvet cloak and withdrew a heavy, embroidered purse. The silver coins inside clinked together with a dull, rich sound as she set it down on the scarred wood between us. It was a substantial amount of wealth, enough to buy passage to a human settlement, enough to survive a winter away from the thermal safety of the pack. It was also a patronizing attempt to assuage whatever minor guilt she possessed, to purchase her own comfort by ensuring the discarded Omega did not freeze to death on her wedding night. "Take this," Evelyn urged softly, pushing the purse slightly toward me. "Consider it a severance. You served this pack well in the greenhouses. There is no need for you to suffer needlessly." I looked down at the velvet purse. noting the intricate crest of the southern silver mine stitched into the fine fabric. The transaction was clear to everyone watching. Take the silver, accept the public pity, and vanish as a grateful, broken subordinate. Instead of raising my voice or showing the sudden flare of cold anger in my blood, I simply reached out. I extended my right hand, laying the tip of my index finger against the heavy, embroidered silk. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of gratitude, nor did I lower myself to an insult. I just left her silver sitting there, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of my refusal answer her charity. Evelyn's polite smile tightened into a thin, bloodless line, her shoulders stiffening under her heavy cloak as the realization hit her. She could buy a weak alpha, and she could buy access to a northern territory, but she did not possess enough silver in all her southern mines to buy my submission. Dismissing her entirely, I turned my attention back to the altar. I watched the priest lift the heavy iron snuffer. The metal was black with decades of accumulated soot, its bell shaped to perfectly cover the binding flame that flickered at the center of the frosted altar. Once that small, resilient fire was deprived of oxygen, my exile would be an absolute certainty, recorded in the ash of the very hearth I had been trained to protect. Donald lowered the iron tool, his knuckles white with the strain of the winter cold. The flame began to flatten under the descending shadow, its light dimming, starving for air against the frozen stone. Suddenly, a voice resonated from the wrought iron brackets. The low frequency of the man's voice literally vibrated the architecture of the keep. Donald froze. The heavy snuffer hovered a fraction of an inch above the struggling fire. The priest's rigid, ceremonial posture slackened in sheer bewilderment, his pale eyes darting upward to the shadowed balconies. Those seats were usually reserved for visiting dignitaries who cared little for regional pack disputes, mostly remaining empty during our harsh northern winters. The interruption was entirely devoid of the dramatic outrage one might expect during a public banishment. It sounded exactly like an auditor correcting a rounding error in a territorial tax ledger. The sheer bureaucratic dryness of the objection caught the entire great keep completely off guard. Alphas did not interrupt Solstice alignments with administrative points of order. They roared, they challenged, they bared teeth and demanded combat. This stranger simply invoked a parliamentary rule with the casual, devastating certainty of a man who owned the building and everything inside it. I did not turn my head, keeping my spine perfectly straight against the freezing drafts, but my peripheral vision caught the immediate physical shift in Logan. The newly declared leader had been standing with his chest expanded, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my silent exit. Now, his jaw tightened so hard I could hear the faint click of his teeth. A ripple of profound unease passed through the assembly, silencing the cruel whispers that had accompanied my disgrace. The tension in the hall changed instantly from mocking amusement to absolute, unmoored confusion. By what authority do you interrupt a sacred proceeding? Logan finally demanded, his voice cracking slightly on the final, forced syllable. It was the defensive, brittle snap of a man trying to project power in a room that had suddenly grown far too large for him. By the authority vested in the structural foundation of this keep, the voice answered, unhurried, rich with a calm, grating friction, like cold iron grinding against deep earth, and the specific legal requirement that a hearth fire cannot be extinguished while a territorial audit is pending. A tall figure emerged from the heavy shadows of the gallery stairs. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm, the heavy tread of his boots striking the stone steps with absolute mathematical precision. Kenneth Vane wore thick charcoal furs that swept the frost-slicked steps, the dark, dense material absorbing the meager light of the hall. There was no aggressive posturing in his descent, no flared scent of dominance meant to cow the lesser wolves into submission. His authority was a matter of spatial geometry, the entire hall oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. I stood beside the altar, my small botanical pouches clutched loosely against my coarse skirt, observing the exact angles of his approach. The sovereign king of the high ridge did not need to run, snarl, or flex to command the room. He occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. As he reached the main floor of the keep, the crowd parted violently. Grown warriors scrambled backward to clear a wide path, their boots scraping frantically against the tiles, desperate to avoid crossing his shadow. He walked directly toward the central dais. His gaze remained fixed ahead, reading the room with the detached efficiency of a tactician evaluating the terrain rather than a predator looking for a fight. Then he stopped. Directly in his path lay the hand-woven silver lichen wrap I had unpinned and discarded moments ago. It rested on the cold stone, a quiet, fragile testament to my severed position. Any ordinary alpha, intent on demonstrating his sheer forward momentum and disregarding the past, would have crushed the delicate dried fibers beneath his heel without a second thought. The local alpha would have kicked it aside just to prove he could. The king paused. He looked down at the discarded botanical work, studying the intricate weave of the seeds. The silence in the cavernous hall stretched, thinning into something brittle and terrifying. With immense, deliberate care, he adjusted his stride, stepping over the fragile lichen with a wide, calculated margin. He refused to let his heavy boots damage a single thread of my labor. That small, precise adjustment of his footwork communicated more danger than a drawn blade. The king stopped a few paces from the altar, folding his hands casually behind his back. The heavy charcoal furs settled around his broad shoulders like a mantle of storm clouds. Logan had puffed his chest to its maximum capacity, desperately attempting to meet the stranger's height. But the effort only made him look strained, rigid, and hollow. The new leader of this northern pack was practically vibrating with nervous aggression, his breathing ragged in the cold air. Beside him, Evelyn Drake had gone completely still, her political calculations failing in real time. The assembly had frozen entirely, caught in the sudden atmospheric shift that always accompanied true sovereignty. But Kenneth did not rely on the heavy, suffocating projection of alpha pheromones to bend the room to his will. Instead, he reached inside the thick charcoal furs draped over his broad shoulders and withdrew a simple, cylindrical object wrapped in dark, oiled leather. The collective breath of the gathered assembly seemed to hitch in unison as he unfastened the leather binding. He revealed a heavy roll of vellum, yellowed with centuries of administrative history, sealed with a massive dark wax stamp. Even from where I stood beside the frosted sacred slab, the faint, dry scent of ancient beeswax and iron gall ink reached me, cutting through the sharp smell of the winter wind. I recognized the intricate pressing of the high ridge sovereign crest instantly, a stylized mountain peak enclosed in a perfect iron ring. Kenneth stepped toward the raised dais where Donald stood immobilized, holding the iron snuffer inches above the binding flame. The High King did not raise his voice. He did not issue a feral command or demand immediate submission from the regional elders. He simply held out the physical document. You are presiding over a Solstice alignment without having reviewed the foundational statutes of the northern domains, Kenneth stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly across the cavernous expanse of the great keep. Donald stared at the sealed vellum as if it were a live serpent coiled to strike. The elders' rigid traditionalism, which only moments ago had been weaponized to seamlessly finalize my exile, now left him paralyzed in the face of an absolute legal authority. The regional assembly, previously murmuring with cruel amusement at my expense, had gone utterly silent. Kenneth broke the dark wax seal with a sharp, clean snap of his thumb. He unrolled the ancient crown covenant. The dry parchment crackled loudly, the crisp, brittle sound carrying clearly in the dead-silent hall. It was a purely mundane noise, just old paper shifting, yet it struck the stone walls with the force of a physical blow. The crackle echoed, sharp and definitive, overriding the howling draft, whistling through the high clerestory windows. "Your Majesty," Donald finally choked out, his knees buckling slightly as the reality of Kenneth's identity crashed down upon him. The priest lowered his head in a deep, trembling bow, the iron snuffer slipping from his grip to clatter uselessly against the stone floor. I watched the exchange with the quiet, detached calculation I usually reserved for assessing winter frost on fragile root systems. Logan had built his power on brute force and wealthy alliances, believing the geographical isolation of our territory protected him from higher administrative scrutiny. He had not anticipated that the sovereign king of the High Ridge would be standing quietly in the witness gallery, documenting every breach of protocol. The crown covenant in Kenneth's hands was not a symbolic artifact. It was the active, binding law of the continent, and its sudden appearance rearranged the geometry of the entire room. Kenneth did not acknowledge the priest's terrified reverence. He simply extended his arm, offering the unrolled parchment. "Place it on the reading desk, Elder Ward," the High King instructed, his tone devoid of anger, which only made it more terrifying, and read Article 9 to the current alpha of this territory. Donald reached out with pale, trembling fingers to take the document. The parchment was heavily weighted at the bottom by a thick wooden dowel carved from dark ironwood to keep the ancient text flat during formal proclamations. As Donald turned and laid the crown covenant upon the slanted stone surface of his ceremonial desk, his hand shook so violently that the wooden dowel knocked repeatedly against the granite. Tap, tap, tap. The frantic, rhythmic sound of the wood striking stone underscored the complete collapse of Donald's usual rigid composure. He fumbled with the edges of the parchment, his eyes darting frantically over the densely packed, archaic script. Logan finally broke his shocked paralysis. He stepped forward from the center of the altar, his jaw tight, his posture stiffening in a desperate attempt to project authority in a room that no longer belonged to him. "Your Majesty, with all due respect to the crown, this is an internal pack matter. The rejection of an inadequate mate is a regional administrative right." Kenneth slowly turned his head to look at Logan. The king did not growl. He did not bare his teeth, drop his stance, or flare his scent to force Logan into biological submission. He merely observed the younger alpha, the way one might observe a structural flaw in a crumbling bridge. "There are no internal matters when a solstice alignment intersects with the geothermal hearth treaties," Kenneth replied, his voice maintaining its steady, measured cadence. "You operate under the protection of the crown's thermal grid, therefore you are bound by its covenants." "Elder Ward, proceed." The ironwood dowel rattled against the stone desk again as Donald leaned his weight onto his elbows, desperately trying to steady his hands. The priest swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, as he located the specific clause near the bottom of the heavy vellum. "Read it clearly," Kenneth added, standing completely still in his thick charcoal furs. "The entire assembly needs to understand the exact nature of the law their alpha has just breached." I remained entirely silent by the altar, keeping my hands neatly folded over my coarse linen skirt. I did not look at Logan, nor did I seek Kenneth's gaze. Instead, I focused my attention on the trembling priest. The architecture of my public humiliation had been built on their rigid adherence to pack law. Now, watching Donald struggle to vocalize the very words that would dismantle Logan's reign, I felt the profound, chilling satisfaction of a botanist watching a parasitic weed wither at the root. The law, it turned out, was a far sharper weapon than claws. The Great Keep was a chamber built for cold acoustics, designed so that a ruler's voice might reach the furthest stone archway without strain. When Elder Donald Ward unrolled the heavy vellum of the Crown Covenant, the sharp crackle of aged parchment filled the space like breaking ice. He did not want to read it. I could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his knuckles whitened around the wooden spools of the ancient wax-sealed document. He was a traditional priest, a man who survived for decades by executing the laws of the strongest local authority. But the man standing over him now was not merely a regional leader. Kenneth occupied the space around the altar the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill the quiet. The sovereign king did not issue a second command. He simply waited, his dark eyes fixed on the elder. Donald cleared his throat, the sound thin and brittle in the frigid air of the temple. His eyes tracked down the illuminated script, searching for the specific mandate, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the archaic northern syntax. Then, he began to read aloud. His voice lacked its usual ceremonial cadence, reduced instead to a hollow, mechanical recitation of the law. "Let it be recorded within the Solstice alignment covenants," the priest read, his tone trembling slightly at the edges, "that the geothermal heartlands are a sovereign trust, leased to the ruling pack only by the grace of the royal thermal network. I stood perfectly still by the frosted stone, the coarse linen of my skirt brushing against the freezing floor. For years I had maintained the deep earth vents, tended the subterranean flora, and regulated the pressure valves beneath this frozen territory. They had always treated it as menial labor, dirty work for a woman lacking a dominant wolf dynamic. Furthermore," Donald continued, swallowing hard as his finger traced the faded iron gall ink, "any alpha who formally severs a mating bond or publicly rejects a certified keeper of the sacred seeds during the sacred alignment shall instantly forfeit all ancestral claims to the geothermal core. The territory's thermal rights shall revert immediately to the crown, rendering the local domain null." The verdict settled into the hall like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack of the vast room. Logan Thorne had been in the middle of adjusting the heavy fur collar of his ceremonial coat, preparing to dismiss me entirely from the estate. At the exact moment Donald pronounced the word forfeit, his hand froze mid-air, his fingers remained curled against the dark pelt, completely paralyzed. The arrogant slope of his shoulders collapsed as the mathematical reality of the ancient treaty struck him. He had not just exiled an unwanted Omega, he had legally terminated his pack's only source of heat for the coming winter. Beside him, Evelyn Drake's perfectly powdered face drained of all color, her grand political victory suddenly transforming into a death sentence of ice. The quiet that followed was absolute, suffocating the ambient murmurs of the witness circle. The Frostwood elite, who had been laughing at my expense only minutes ago, now stared at the royal intruder in unvarnished terror. The ambient temperature in the room felt as though it had already dropped 10 degrees. The psychological weight of the severed thermal contract pressing against our lungs. Evelyn was the first to break the paralysis. She was an heiress of the southern silver mines, a woman raised on account books, trade disputes, and calculated risks. She did not throw a physical tantrum or collapse in tears. Instead, she adjusted her posture, stepping forward with the stiff, artificial grace of a diplomat trying to defuse a border war. In her hands, she held the leather-bound employment registry of the pack, the very book she had intended to use to erase my name from the estate's payroll before nightfall. "Your Majesty," Evelyn began, her voice pitched in a polite, steady cadence that only barely concealed her rising panic. She tapped a manicured fingernail sharply against the cover of the registry. Tap, tap, surely. There is a fundamental misunderstanding of the text here today. This clause explicitly protects a certified keeper. Maren Sterling is a botanist, a gardener who handles dirt and basic medicinal roots. She opened the book, flipping the thick pages with frantic, trembling precision until she found the administrative logs. She holds no formal seat on the council. She possesses no title of nobility. She is merely low-status labor, contracted to maintain the greenhouse. The law cannot protect a servant. Logan immediately latched onto the legal loophole. His frozen hand finally dropped from his collar, his jaw tightening as he stepped aggressively beside his chosen bride. Lady Evelyn is entirely correct, he argued, aiming for a tone of reasonable authority, though his scent reeked of terror. Marin is not a titled official. When Evelyn tapped her finger against the ledger a third time, the sovereign slowly tilted his head. His gaze shifted from the desperate noblewoman to the panicked Alpha. He looked at them not as formidable rivals, but as a clerk might look at a particularly flawed column of arithmetic. They were trying to litigate their way out of a contract they had already broken, utterly blind to the fact that power did not reside in the margins of Evelyn's little book. It resided in the evidence I carried in my pockets. The great hall remained thick with the sharp echo of their accusations. They expected me to defend myself, to plead my legitimacy against the claims that I was nothing more than a dirt-stained botanist unfit for a sovereign altar. I did not speak. I had long ago learned that arguing with arrogance was a waste of perfectly good breath. Instead of offering a frantic defense, I slid my hands into the deep pockets sewn along the inner lining of my coarse linen skirt. The fabric was stiff against my knuckles, freezing from the ambient temperature of the unheated sanctuary. What rested at the bottom of the pockets was heavier than the surrounding cold. My fingers closed around the solid, brutal weight of the thermal keys. I drew them out into the pale, slanting winter light that filtered through the clerestory windows. They were not ornamental trinkets or delicate ceremonial jewelry designed for display. They were massive, forged blocks of dark iron, scored with deep architectural grooves and smelling faintly of sulfur and deep earth minerals. I stepped forward and laid them flat onto the frosted stone of the primary days. The metal made a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate straight through the floorboards. Beside the iron, I placed my family's botanical journals. The thick leather bindings were cracked from years of exposure to the geothermal vents, the covers permanently stained with dried sap and faded black ink. These were not books of magic or lineage myths, but decades of meticulous, undeniable data. The king stepped closer to the altar, his dark eyes tracking the deliberate motion of my hands. He did not interrupt me. Kenneth occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He watched as I opened the top journal, the brittle parchment, making a dry, scratching sound in the quiet keep. The pages documented the exact calibration of the southern vents, the harvest cycles of the sacred seeds, and the pressure logs of the subterranean core dating back 3 generations. It was absolute, mathematical proof of labor that sustained the entire territory, written in the cramped, careful hand of my predecessors. Evelyn shifted in the periphery, the heavy silk of her gown rustling like dry leaves against the stone. She stared at the iron blocks on the altar, her previous confidence faltering as she recognized the complex grooves of the master locking mechanism. Logan remained rigid, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the undeniable evidence of my authority that he had so casually dismissed. I did not look at either of them. My attention remained fixed on the documents, smoothing a wrinkled edge of parchment with the pad of my thumb. The keys sat between us, cold and dormant, yet possessing the absolute power to either sustain or suffocate the domain. Kenneth reached out, his gloved fingers tracing the air just above the edge of the iron without actually touching the sacred metal. He was verifying the physical architecture, comparing the asymmetrical cuts in the iron to the specifications written in the ancient covenant he held. There was a profound, quiet respect in his posture. He was not looking at me as a discarded woman to be pitied, but as a primary technician who held the survival of a continent on the altar stone. The truth was not something to be debated in loud, aggressive shouts. It was written in the ledger, forged in the iron, and waiting for the law to acknowledge it. The sovereign king withdrew his hand from the perimeter of the keys and turned his broad shoulders toward the trembling pack elder. Donald stood frozen by the side of the altar, the ceremonial rejection documents still clutched defensively to his chest. Kenneth extended a single open palm. He did not issue a verbal command or raise his voice, yet the absolute authority in his simple, expectant gesture left no room for hesitation. The elder hastily fumbled with his stack of papers, surrendering a pristine blank sheet of royal registry parchment. His knuckles were pale and shaking against the heavy vellum as he handed it over. Taking the parchment, the monarch smoothed it over the flat surface of the stone, directly beside my grandfather's open journal. From a hidden pocket inside his charcoal furs, Kenneth retrieved a silver transcription quill and a hardened block of royal sealing wax. He uncapped a brass portable heating vial, twisting the top until a thin, focused flame sparked to life in the freezing air. The entire process was meticulously unhurried. The king held the wax over the flame, watching with measured patience as the solid red block began to soften, blister, and weep. As the liquid pooled onto the bottom right corner of the vellum, the sharp, resinous scent of burnt pine filled the immediate space between us. It was a grounding, distinctly northern smell, cutting straight through the stale, bitter frost of the great keep and overriding the expensive floral perfumes worn by the southern nobility. Kenneth leaned in, his face inches from the document, and blew softly on the hot red wax, to cool it before pressing the heavy base of his sovereign ring into the center of the pool. The wet, precise sound of the metal stamping into the hardening resin echoed off the high, vaulted ceiling. He stepped back, allowing the seal to fully set in the winter air. The document now bore the unquestionable mark of its mountain kingdom, legally binding and structurally absolute. Kenneth turned his dark, calculating gaze toward the assembly, his voice absolute. The elder priest bowed his head in immediate submission to the royal stamp, physically stepping away from the ex-alpha and his chosen bride to align himself with the new legal reality. The administrative execution was complete, leaving no loophole, no room for political maneuvering, and no possibility of reversal. The power dynamic of the entire territory had just been fundamentally restructured, not by the brute force of fangs or claws, but by dry ink, cold iron, and a single drop of hardened pine wax. The High King did not gloat over the legal devastation he had just unleashed upon the Frostwood territory. He did not turn to survey the panicked faces of the elite who had mocked me only an hour ago. Instead, Kenneth closed the remaining distance between us. His movements were unhurried, measured by the deliberate, steady rhythm of a man who never had to rush to prove his authority. His heavy charcoal furs brushed against the frost-rimed flagstones, the dense material absorbing the chill rather than reflecting it. I stood perfectly still, my breathing shallow, holding my posture rigid against the sudden shift in the room's gravity. I expected him to issue a royal command, to formally draft me into his court as a newly recognized warden. Men of his rank usually collected resources, human and geographic alike, with the sweep of a pen or the sharp edge of a sword. But the sovereign stopped exactly 3 paces away, maintaining a physical boundary that no other alpha would have bothered to observe. Then, the ruler of the high ridge lowered his imposing frame. The metallic clink of a hidden buckle sounded beneath his cloak as his right knee met the freezing stone of the sanctuary's centerpiece. A collective, sharp inhalation ripped through the hall. Logan took a stumbling step backward, the toe of his boot scraping harshly against the floorboards, while Evelyn's perfectly manicured fingers flew to her throat. Pack elders who had spent their entire lives enforcing rigid hierarchies stared in uncomprehending horror as the highest authority on the continent bowed his head before an omega they had deemed worthless. He did not reach for my waist. The king did not grab my wrists to assert a territorial claim, nor did he attempt to pull me into his scent field to establish dominance. He simply rested his hands, palms facing upward on his own thighs. It was a posture of absolute vulnerability and absolute respect. He was offering me the power to walk away. "Marin Sterling," he said, his voice a low, even cadence that vibrated against the frozen architecture of the temple. There was no growl, no beastly possessiveness woven into his tone. It was the calm articulation of a statesman. The high ridge requires a queen who understands the true value of the land, one who does not break under the weight of false judgment. I ask not for your submission, but for your partnership. Will you grant me your hand and stand beside me as my sovereign Luna?" He left the choice suspended in the freezing air, his gaze steady, waiting for my answer without a trace of coercion. The magnitude of his offer settled over me, not as a wave of romantic hysteria, but as a cool, clear architectural blueprint. If I declined, I would still be the warden, possessing the thermal keys to a dying territory, isolated and burdened with the survival of a pack that had just tried to throw me to the winter wolves. If I accepted, I would bind myself to the apex of the continental hierarchy. It was a political alliance of immense scale, a merging of ancient ecological authority with unyielding military and legal power. I looked past him for a fraction of a second. Logan was pale, his jaw slack, the arrogance entirely drained from his posture atipsalide, as he realized that the woman he had discarded was currently being handed the sovereignty of the North. Evelyn looked physically ill, her eyes darting between my simple linen skirt and the kneeling monarch. They had built their future on superficial wealth, ignoring the structural foundation that kept the ice at bay. I returned my focus to Kenneth. My gaze drifted downward, studying the large, open palms resting on his knees. They were not the soft, pampered hands of a ruler who only observed from a balcony. I saw the thick calluses lining the base of his fingers, the scars etched across his knuckles from years of practical labor. And there, near the joint of his right thumb, was a small faded smear of black ink. It was the mark of a man who spent his nights reading treaties, drafting laws, and studying the realm's architecture. I did not feel the chaotic, biological pull of a fated mate bond overriding my senses. I felt something far more durable, recognition. He had watched my technical competence, verified my records, and decided I was his equal. I took a slow breath, the freezing air biting at the back of my throat, and stepped forward. I raised my right hand, the skin still carrying a faint trace of ceremonial ash, and placed it firmly into his open palm, his fingers curled around mine, not trapping me, but anchoring me. His skin was incredibly warm against the encroaching chill of the temple. The pact was sealed not with a display of brute force, but with a simple, logical consensus. Kenneth Vane did not pull me into a frantic embrace, nor did he issue a territorial roar. Such crude displays belonged to lesser men who needed volume to compensate for a lack of true authority. Instead, the High King simply nodded, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of the bond we had just forged under the law. He rose gracefully from the cold floor, the thick charcoal furs of his cloak sweeping silently against the flagstones. For a brief moment, he looked down at me. His expression remained composed, but I noticed the subtle relaxation in his broad shoulders, a quiet satisfaction that I had chosen to wield my own sovereignty rather than retreat into the shadows of exile. He did not touch me, respecting the physical boundary of the altar, but his presence was a steady, impenetrable wall against the hostility of the room. Then, Kenneth turned back to face Logan. The shift in his posture was entirely unhurried, yet the entire hall oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. He stood with his hands loosely clasped behind his back. He projected an absolute confidence that made the towering alpha of this isolated pack look suddenly very small, stripped of his ceremonial grandeur. Logan's jaw worked silently, his chest heaving as his eyes darted between the ancient parchment on the altar and the imposing figure of the sovereign king. "The transfer of jurisdiction is complete," Kenneth stated, his voice a steady rumble that carried effortlessly to the furthest corners of the gallery. He did not raise his tone. He didn't have to. By the strict definitions of the Crown Covenant, the thermal rights of this territory no longer belong to your specific lineage. They are now the sole property of the royal domain, administered exclusively by my wife. Logan blinked, his arrogant sneer crumbling into genuine administrative panic. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue a precedent or invoke some forgotten local loophole regarding the separation of pack assets, but the words died in his throat. Kenneth raised a single, leather-gloved hand, stopping the protest before it could form. "You will address her correctly, Alpha Thorn," Kenneth instructed, the polite veneer of his words failing to mask the crushing command beneath them. He gestured toward me with a slow, sweeping motion of his arm, physically yielding the floor to my authority. "You stand before the sovereign Luna of our sovereign realm. Acknowledge her title, or I will consider your silence an act of territorial treason against the crown." I watched Logan struggle with the mathematical reality of his ruin. He looked at me, truly looked at me, not as the quiet botanist whose bloodline he had deemed insufficient, but as the sudden architect of his pack's survival. His face flushed a dark red against the stark white of his ceremonial tunic. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides, fighting the ingrained pride of a man who had never been forced to bow. "Sovereign," Logan choked out, the syllables scraping against his pride like broken glass. It was a meager, breathless concession, practically spat at the stone floor, but it was enough to satisfy the legal requirements of the assembly. Kenneth's gaze remained flat and unimpressed by the display of temper. He tilted his head slightly, returning his full attention to me. "My queen," he murmured, the title resting on his tongue with natural ease, entirely devoid of mockery. "The territory's infrastructure requires an immediate update. I believe it is time you executed your authority over the thermal rites." I picked up the thermal keys from the altar, looking down at the heavy iron objects resting in my palm. The thermal keys were not ornate, nor were they decorated with the jewels that adorned Evelyn's bridal gown. They were brutally pragmatic tools, forged from dark, pitted iron and designed to endure the intense geothermal pressures boiling beneath the keep. They felt exceptionally cold against my bare skin, a stark physical reminder of the immense power they represented. For years, I had maintained the subterranean valves in quiet obscurity, carefully regulating the pressure to ensure warmth reached every hearth in the Frostwood domain, while the pack elites deliberately ignored the soot stained into my knuckles. Now, the soot was washed away, and only the raw mechanics of justice remained in my hands. I stepped away from Kenneth, moving toward the side of the massive stone block where the primary control mechanism was housed. My coarse linen skirt brushed against the frosted stone, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the hall. Logan instinctively twitched forward, a raw, desperate sound of protest tearing from his throat as he realized what I was about to do. But a single sharp look from Kenneth pinned him to the floor, freezing him in place, without a single weapon being drawn. Beside him, Evelyn Drake stood entirely paralyzed. Her carefully calculated political smile had completely dissolved, replaced by the dawning horror of a noblewoman realizing she had just traded her vast southern fortune to marry into a bankrupt, freezing estate. Her eyes tracked my movements with a terrified, rigid intensity. I did not look at them. I focused entirely on the ancient locking mechanism embedded deep within the side of the stone altar. The grooves of the lock were worn smooth by centuries of careful use, a mechanical threshold that separated survival from the bitter northern wastes. Holding my breath, I slid the primary thermal key into the heavy iron slot. It fit perfectly, biting into the internal pins with a satisfying, harsh scrape of metal against metal. This was not an act of petty, emotional revenge. It was an administrative correction. Logan had severed the mate bond of his own free will, and the ancient law demanded that the territorial warmth follow the warden. I gripped the cold iron handle with both hands, planting my boots firmly against the uneven floorboards to gain leverage. The mechanism was incredibly old and heavy, requiring significant physical effort to shift the massive subterranean valves that controlled the core's output. I pushed forward, leaning my entire body weight into the turn, feeling the resistance of decades-old iron pushing back against my palms. For a second, the iron resisted, locked in its current alignment by years of continuous flow. Then, the internal tumblers gave way with a heavy snap. As I turned the key fully to the left, a loud, deep clunk of shifting iron gears echoed through the cavernous space. The sound was immense, a visceral, mechanical thud that travelled outward across the entire keep. It was the unmistakable, structural sound of the main geothermal junction closing off. Beneath our feet, the steady, comforting rumble of the subterranean steam vents abruptly ceased. The silence that rushed into the void was deafening. The thermal flow to Logan's sector had been physically and legally severed. I pulled the key free from the altar, the ironed teeth gleaming faintly in the dim light of the ceremonial beeswax candles. I did not need to shout, nor did I need to demand an apology from the man who had just discarded me. I slipped the heavy key into the leather pouch at my waist, securing the brass buckle with methodical precision. Without the continuous flow of subterranean steam, the thermodynamic collapse of the hall was nearly instantaneous. The warm, cedar-scented updrafts that usually bathed the central altar in a comfortable haze vanished, replaced by the crushing weight of the northern winter, pressing in from the outside. The heavy iron grates lining the perimeter of the ceremonial chamber emitted one final, dying hiss of vapor before plunging into cold dormancy. Frost began to trace delicate crystalline patterns along the edges of the high stained glass windows, and the ambient temperature dropped so fast that my breath turned into a visible plume of white mist. The silence that followed the shutdown was heavy and profound, broken only by the shivering realization washing over the assembly. Frost continued to claim the stained glass windows, creeping inward over the lead framing with unnatural speed. The council members, who only moments ago had been chuckling into their wine cups at my expected exile, now stood frozen in the literal sense. Disjointed murmurs rippled through the packed ranks of the elite, escalating swiftly into a chaotic clamor as they bumped into one another, rubbing their bare arms. They had spent their entire lives insulated by the warmth I meticulously maintained, taking for granted the quiet labor that kept their massive fortress habitable. Now, as the ambient temperature plummeted below freezing, the stark reality of their thin clothing and unsealed walls became impossible to ignore. They were simply tenants in a fragile building whose primary utility had just been legally shut off. Alpha Logan Thorne stared at the cold stone floor, his jaw slack. He looked as if he expected the vents to magically reopen through the sheer force of his authority, unable to process that brute strength could not override an administrative lock. Beside him, the color drained from Evelyn Drake's face. She had aligned herself with Frostwood to secure a thriving, heated stronghold for her southern silver wealth. Instead, she had just inherited a dying, dark glacier. I watched without blinking as Evelyn wrapped her expensive, sheer silk shawl tighter around her shoulders. The delicate fabric, designed entirely for aesthetic display in a climate-controlled court, offered no protection against the biting air of the wildlands. When she parted her painted lips to speak to Logan, her breath bloomed into a thick plume of visible white mist. It hung in the rapidly cooling hall like a ghost, a physical testament to their ruin. The downfall of the arrogant was not marked by a bloody battle. It was marked by the undeniable consequence of a broken legal contract. The territory was freezing, the infrastructure was dead, and the law offered them no shelter. The physical shock of the creeping frost finally broke Logan's paralysis. The reality of a dead geothermal core meant immediate economic ruin. Without a heated fortress, his pack would fracture, and the lucrative southern trade routes would freeze shut by nightfall. The grand empire he thought he had secured by publicly discarding me was collapsing before his eyes. It was not destroyed by my vengeance, but by my simple, quiet withdrawal of service. He turned toward me, his smooth composure completely erased, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed stare. "Marin," he said, his voice cracking against the frigid air, sounding thin and reedy without the echo of the warm drafts. "Marin, wait, this is a misunderstanding. The registry, the keys. We can amend the decree. We can rewrite the contract." He took a desperate step forward, his broad shoulders hunching instinctively against the dropping temperature. "You don't have to leave the pack. You don't have to travel to the capital. I can provision a place for you here, a high-ranking consort, a permanent seat on the inner council with full thermal privileges." He actually believed the transaction was still open. He believed that my silence at the altar had been a calculated negotiation tactic, that I was simply waiting for a better offer to resume my invisible labor. Logan took another step toward the altar, his teeth audibly chattering in the bitter draught, sweeping through the great hall. He reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to close the distance between us, perhaps hoping his sheer physical bulk would force me to step backward into compliant submission. I did not shrink away. I did not seek refuge behind Kenneth's towering frame, though the sovereign king stood perfectly still beside me, a mountain of dark fur and absolute authority. Kenneth made no move to block Logan, watching the former alpha, with the cold, measured gaze of an executioner, waiting for a signature, perfectly content to let me handle my own boundaries. Instead of stepping back, I simply raised my right hand. It was a small, quiet gesture, just a palm facing outward, holding the space between us. Logan stopped immediately. He hit that invisible boundary and froze, his hand hovering uselessly in the empty, freezing air. Looking at him standing there in the cold, my pulse did not race. My hands did not shake with the urge to strike him, nor did my chest swell with the need to gloat over his ruin. I simply looked at the man who had intended to cast me into the winter wastes just minutes ago, and saw him exactly as he was, a failing, incompetent administrator who had fundamentally misunderstood the machinery that kept him alive. "The covenant is sealed, Logan," I said, my voice low, clear, and perfectly even, cutting through the shivering murmurs of the hall. "The keys have been turned. Your access is revoked." I addressed him not as a discarded partner pleading for an apology, but as a landlord delivering a final eviction notice to a defaulting tenant. There was nothing left to barter with, no shared history to leverage, no spark of warmth to reignite. The ledger was officially closed, the balance was settled, and the geothermal warmth he had so arrogantly thrown away would never return to his hearth. The temperature in the great keep was dropping with brutal efficiency. Every breath Logan Thorne exhaled bloomed into a thick, ragged white cloud of desperation. The moisture in the air was already beginning to crystallize, rhyming the edges of the high-woven banners with a delicate, creeping frost. Logan lunged forward one last time, not with the bared fangs of a challenged alpha, but with the frantic, uncoordinated stumble of a ruined man. His hands, previously manicured and steady, clawed at the stone edge of the sacrificial stone, as if he could physically pry the heat back into the ancient rock. "You cannot do this." Logan's voice cracked, shedding the resonant timbre of a pack leader and reducing down to the shrill panic of a cornered debtor. "The Frost Wood Pack has held this domain for 6 generations. You cannot erase an entire bloodline with a single stroke of ink. It violates the old treaties. It violates the foundational hierarchy of the northern clans." Kenneth did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The High King stepped forward, his heavy charcoal furs absorbing the frantic noise of the room. From the inner pocket of his coat, he withdrew a folded sheet of heavy, royal-stamped parchment, the formal decree of territorial confiscation. He laid it flat against the freezing surface of the altar, right beside the locked thermal mechanism. "The hierarchy," Kenneth said, his tone as level and unyielding as a glacier, "is predicated entirely on the Crown Covenant. You broke Article 9. You publicly discarded the Warden. Consequently, the land no longer recognizes your sovereignty, and neither does the Crown." The king did not draw a sword. He did not bare his teeth. nor did he project a suffocating dominant aura to force Logan to his knees. Instead, Kenneth unclipped a simple iron pen from his breast pocket. The metal was dark, heavy, and completely unadorned. He unscrewed the cap with slow, methodical precision, the faint scrape of the threading loud in the silent hall. Logan watched the pen as if it were a loaded weapon. Wait, please, Your Majesty. We can renegotiate the terms of the seasonal tribute. I can offer you a higher percentage of the timber yields from the eastern ridge. I can redirect the border taxes directly to your treasury. Just give me the keys back. Kenneth ignored the frantic bargaining. He pressed the iron nib to the thick parchment. The scratching sound of the pen across the rough surface echoed clearly in the vast cooling hall. It was a terrifyingly quiet sound, carrying the crushing weight of absolute administrative finality. With 4 sharp, deliberate strokes, Kenneth severed 6 generations of regional rule. He signed the decree, blew gently on the wet ink to dry it in the freezing air, and slid the document toward the edge of the stone. Logan stared at his own ruin, his jaw trembling violently, his status stripped away not by a victorious conqueror in a bloody arena, but by a quiet sovereign with a pen. Evelyn Drake did not scream. She did not weep for her ruined fiancé, nor did she attempt to comfort him. She was a woman born to the southern silver mines, raised on ledger margins, extraction quotas, and ruthless pragmatism. As Logan sank to his knees in the spreading frost, his hands gripping his hair in despair, Evelyn simply stepped around him. She did not even look down at the man she had proudly claimed as her partner less than an hour ago. Her heavy velvet skirts swept over the cooling stone as she approached the altar, her posture straightening into the practiced, rigid elegance of a political diplomat. From the inner sleeve of her gown, she withdrew a tightly rolled cylinder of vellum. She unfurled it with quick, sharp movements, smoothing it flat directly over the freshly signed confiscation decree. It was a meticulously drawn mining map, detailing the rich, unexcavated silver veins of the southern mountains, marked with red wax coordinates. "Your Majesty," Evelyn said, her voice remarkably smooth, attempting to construct a bridge of pure logic over the massive chasm of her mistake. "Logan Thorne is clearly a tactical liability, but the southern mines are not. My family controls 70% of the raw silver extraction in this region. We have resources, we have capital. The High Ridge constantly requires silver for its currency and trade agreements." She leaned closer, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the densest cluster of marked ore on the parchment. "I am not tied to this fool. I am tied to profit. If you guarantee my family's estates a continuous flow of geothermal heat, bypassing his ruined territory, I will sign exclusive extraction rights over to the Crown. A private arrangement, purely financial, completely separate from this broken mating ceremony. We can salvage this evening's political value." I watched her from my place beside the king, observing the sheer, breathtaking audacity of her calculation. She honestly believed that power was just a matter of finding the right currency to buy a pardon. Kenneth looked down at the map. He did not express anger, nor did he show any disgust at her instant disloyalty. He simply reached for the small, brass-capped inkwell resting on the far corner of the altar, the one Donald Ward had used earlier to draft my now-voided exile orders. The king lifted the inkwell. He tilted it sideways over the stone. Not a single drop of black liquid spilled out. The sudden, catastrophic drop in the room's temperature had already frozen the ink solid within the glass chamber. Kenneth set the inkwell down with a dull, heavy thud. He tapped the frozen glass once with his iron pen, a sharp, ringing sound that cut through Evelyn's sales pitch. "Your silver is buried beneath 40 feet of permafrost, Lady Evelyn," Kenneth stated, his voice dry, analytical, and entirely detached. "Without the thermal keys, the ground in your territory will be as solid as iron by midnight. You cannot mine it, you cannot transport it, you cannot sell it." Evelyn's smooth composure finally fractured. Her breath caught. her eyes darting from the frozen inkwell to the unyielding face of the king, the physical reality of the thermal cutoff finally sinking into her bones. Raw materials mean nothing in the dark, Kenneth continued, stepping away from the altar and turning his attention back to me, dismissing her entirely. You tied your fortune to a man who threw away the only flame that could keep your empire alive. Your mines are currently worthless. Your negotiation is declined. The heavy iron-bound cover of the Royal Bloodline Registry hit the stone podium with a hollow thud that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my boots. Elder Donald Ward did not shiver, though the temperature inside the great keep had already plummeted fast enough that our breath plumed white in the dimming light. He was a creature of strict ceremonial law, a priest who found his only warmth in the absolute certainty of administrative procedure. The chaos unfolding behind us, the frantic whispering of the native council, the desperate, rattling breaths of those who suddenly realized their thermal sanctuary was legally and physically dead, did not concern him. The Crown Covenant had been invoked. The geopolitical architecture of the domain had shifted. Donald simply followed the ink. He unclasped the brass latches of the massive ledger. The scent of ancient vellum, dried beeswax, and iron gall ink rose from the pages, cutting sharply through the metallic ozone of the freezing air. The elder accepted the iron pen Kenneth offered him. He did not look at the disgraced Alpha, shivering in the shadows. Nor did he cast a glance at the southern heiress, whose vast silver fortune could not buy a single spark of geothermal heat. He looked only at the parchment, his posture rigid and unyielding beneath his ceremonial robes. By the authority of the Solstice alignment and the original thermal covenants, Donald recited, his voice a dry, papery rasp that carried perfectly across the cooling stone. The territory of the Supreme Monarch formally recognizes its unified sovereignty. He pressed the iron nib to the heavy page. The scratching of his pen writing my name felt like a heavy, definitive heartbeat echoing through the freezing room. It was not a loud sound, but in the profound, suffocating silence of the defeated pack, every stroke was a hammer blow against their pride. I watched the dark ink bleed into the vellum, spelling out the letters of my identity: Marin Sterling, Sovereign Luna, and Warden of the Hearth. Donald sprinkled a pinch of fine sand over the page to blot the heavy script, then blew the excess dust away. Ink dried faster than tears in the bitter northern wind. I had spent my entire life as an invisible botanist in the background of this hall, a minor variable easily replaced and dismissed. Now, my name was the only legal foundation holding the Northern Territories together. I did not smile. I did not turn to gloat at the people who had mocked my bloodline less than an hour ago. True sovereignty was the quiet drying of ink on a legally binding document. I let that knowledge settle into my chest like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, and filling every crack of doubt I had ever harbored. The brass latches clicked shut with a metallic finality. The truth was now structurally undeniable. The frost was already creeping up the base of the great altar, mapping intricate, jagged patterns across the stone by the time Kenneth turned to me. He moved without the hurried panic that possessed the rest of the hall. The king occupied his space with unhurried grace, holding his power in strict reserve. He did not issue any gloating commands to the ex-alpha crouched on the freezing floor. He did not demand that the remaining elders kneel or beg for a restoration of the thermal flow. The absolute withdrawal of his presence and the severing of the territory's lifeblood was punishment enough. "Are we finished here, Warden?" Kenneth asked, his voice low, a quiet rumble of timber and gravel that resonated purely for my ears. He did not grab my wrist to pull me away. He did not attempt to drag me toward the exit to prove his territorial dominance to the watching crowd. He simply offered his arm, a steady, physical anchor waiting entirely for my permission. "The ledger is closed," I answered, keeping my tone as measured as his. I retrieved my hand-woven silver lichen wrap from the floor, pulling it tightly across my shoulders, letting it drape naturally over the heavy, dark wool of my winter garments. The wrap had been a symbol of a low-status servant when the night began. Now it rested seamlessly against the sovereign charcoal furs of the king standing beside me. I placed my hand on his forearm. The thick velvet and fur under my palm felt like the only source of genuine warmth left in the great keep. Together, we walked down the central aisle. The remaining pack members parted for us, scrambling back against the freezing walls, their eyes wide with the chilling reality of their own arrogance. They hugged their thin ceremonial cloaks around themselves, their teeth already beginning to chatter as the deep winter cold reclaimed the fortress. As we reached the towering oak doors of the temple threshold, Kenneth stopped to push the heavy iron beam aside. The bitter northern wind immediately rushed in, carrying the clean scent of pine and fresh snow. The cold outside was brutal, but it felt sharp and pure compared to the stagnant, dying air of the hall we were leaving behind. Before we crossed the boundary into the night, I paused. I turned slightly toward him, lifting my free hand to adjust the heavy fur collar of his royal cloak where the wind had caught it. I smoothed the thick pelt against his neck, pulling the dark fabric closer to shield his throat from the draft. It was a quiet gesture, a small domestic calibration of warmth applied to the most dangerous man on the continent. Kenneth stilled completely under my touch. He looked down at me, his sharp gaze softening just a fraction, acknowledging the profound mutual respect embedded in the simple act. There were no grand, explosive declarations of destiny. There were no coercive demands for the future. There was only the scent of cedar and ozone, and the steady foundation of a partnership built on undeniable competence and chosen safety. I dropped my hand, my fingertips brushing the edge of his collar one last time. "Let us go home," I said quietly. He offered a single, shallow nod, shifting his stance to block the worst of the wind from my shoulders. And for the first time in a very long time, I walked through a door without checking first whether I was allowed, stepping out into the clean winter dark, leaving the ruined pack to freeze in the shadow of their own laws.